The burgundy dress hung in my closet like a ghost of better times. I'd worn it to Imani's high school graduation, watching my baby girl stride across that stage with her head held high and her future bright before her. I wore it again when she graduated from Indiana State with her marketing degree, and later when she called to tell me about her first big promotion at the firm downtown. Each time, she'd told me how elegant I looked, how proud she was to have me as her mama. Now, as I smoothed the fabric over my 62-year-old frame, standing in the bedroom Leonard and I had shared for 40 years before the cancer took him, I wondered if this burgundy dress would witness the final chapter of my relationship with my daughter. It was a Tuesday evening in October, and the autumn light slanted through my window with that particular golden quality that always reminded me of endings. 3 weeks had passed since our explosive argument about her wedding budget. 3 weeks of silence that felt like 3 years. 3 weeks of staring at my phone, willing it to ring, hoping she'd come to her senses. The confrontation replayed in my mind like a film I couldn't stop watching. Imani and Devin, sitting on my worn sofa in the duplex living room, presenting their demands. Not requests, demands, like I was some kind of bank they had the right to make withdrawals from. "Mama, we need $65,000 for the wedding," Imani had said, her voice carrying an edge I'd never heard before. Not asking, telling. I'd actually laughed, thinking it was a joke. "Baby, that's more than your daddy and I spent on our entire first year of marriage, including the down payment on our house." "Times have changed, Mama." She'd exchanged a look with Devin that made my stomach tighten. Weddings cost money. Real weddings. The kind that reflect who we are and where we're going in life. "Where you're going." I'd set down my coffee cup carefully, buying myself time to process what I was hearing. "Baby, I thought you were going toward a marriage, toward building a life together. Since when does that require imported Italian marble for a bathroom renovation?" That's when Devin had leaned forward, all expensive cologne and practiced charm. "Mrs. Washington, with all due respect, it's not just about the wedding. It's about setting ourselves up for success. The bathroom renovation will increase the property value of the condo. The Maldives honeymoon will give us networking opportunities with other successful couples. These are investments." "Investments in what?" I'd asked. "In appearing successful or in actually being successful?" Imani's face had gone cold then, colder than I'd ever seen it. "You're sitting on all that money from Daddy's life insurance, Mama. Just sitting on it while we're trying to start our life together. Don't you want me to be happy?" The accusation had hit me like a slap. Leonard's life insurance. The money he'd worked himself to exhaustion to provide. The nest egg we'd planned would carry me through retirement, maybe leave something for our children when I was gone. Money I'd been carefully managing, living modestly in this duplex instead of the 4-bedroom house we'd raised our family in, clipping coupons and budgeting every dollar so it would last. "Of course I want you to be happy, sweetheart," I'd said, trying to keep my voice steady. "That's why I'm offering you $15,000. That's more than generous. That'll pay for a beautiful ceremony at the church, a nice reception, flowers, music, everything you need for a wedding that celebrates your love." "$15,000? Imani had looked at me like I'd offered her pocket change. "Mama, that won't even cover the photographer and videographer we want." "Then maybe you need different photographers. Or maybe you need to stop being selfish." The word had hung in the air between us like poison. Selfish. Me. The woman who'd worked 2 jobs to help pay for her college. Who'd nursed her through every childhood illness. Who'd taught her to read and to ride a bike and to stand up for herself. Selfish. "Imani," I'd started, but Devin had cut me off. "I think what Imani is trying to say, Mrs. Washington, is that family helps family. And right now, we need your help to launch our future properly." That's when I'd noticed it. The way he said, "We need your help," but his eyes were calculating the numbers. The way he touched Imani's hand, not like a man comforting his fiancée, but like a handler managing his asset. The way he looked at my modest duplex like he was already tallying what it might sell for. "I've made my offer," I'd said, standing up. $15,000, given with love and best wishes. If that's not enough for you, then I'm sorry, but that's what I can do." Imani had stood too, her hand going to her belly in a gesture I'd seen her make more and more lately. She was 3 months pregnant, barely showing, but already using that baby like a bargaining chip. "Fine, Mama. If that's how you feel, if that's really all we mean to you, then I guess we know where we stand." She'd grabbed her purse, and Devin had followed her to the door. Don't expect to be involved in this baby's life if you can't be involved in supporting our family properly." The door had closed behind them, and I'd stood in my living room, surrounded by family photos that suddenly felt like documentation of a relationship that was already over. The little girl who used to bring me dandelions from the yard, calling them sunshine flowers because they were so bright. Where had she gone? When had my daughter become this stranger who saw me as nothing more than a source of funding? That was 3 weeks ago. Now, as I applied my lipstick with a hand that had learned steadiness through years of practice, I tried to summon hope. This morning, Imani had called. Her voice had been different, softer, almost vulnerable, like the daughter I remembered. "Mama, I've been thinking about what you said, about both of us being too stubborn. Maybe we need to talk. Really talk." My heart had lifted despite my better judgment. "I'd like that, baby. Devin and I thought we could take you out to dinner, somewhere nice. You know Franco's, that Italian place on Meridian Street? We could meet there tonight, around 6:30, just talk things through." Franco's, the restaurant where Leonard had taken me for our 25th anniversary, where we'd shared ossobuco and held hands across the table like teenagers, marveling that we'd built a life together that included 2 beautiful children, a paid-off house, and love that had only deepened with time. Franco's, where the lighting was soft and the tables intimate, and the memories were still so vivid I could almost see Leonard's smile in the candlelight. "That sounds lovely, sweetheart," I'd said, already planning what I'd say, how I'd build that bridge back to my daughter. Now, checking my reflection one last time, I tried to convince myself that the pregnancy had changed something in Imani, that carrying new life had awakened in her an understanding of what I'd sacrificed, what I'd protected, what really mattered. Maybe she was ready to see me as something more than a resource to be tapped. Maybe she was ready to see me as her mother again. The drive to Franco's took me through the old neighborhood, the one Leonard and I had chosen so carefully when Imani was just a baby and Jamal was starting kindergarten, past Riverside Elementary, where I'd volunteered in the library every Tuesday for 6 years, reading stories to wide-eyed children who hung on every word, past Washington Park, where I'd pushed both my babies on the swings until my arms ached, their laughter floating up into the summer sky like prayers of pure joy, past the community center where I'd taught Imani to waltz before her first formal dance, her feet clumsy on mine until suddenly she'd gotten it, her face lighting up with the realization that she could do this. She could be graceful. She could shine. Each landmark felt like a page in a book I wasn't sure I was ready to close. This was the geography of my motherhood, the map of a life spent raising children and building a family and trying to do right by everyone I loved. Franco's looked exactly as I remembered. The warm brick facade glowed in the early evening light, window boxes overflowing with late autumn mums in shades of burgundy and gold. Through the gauze curtains, I could see the soft flicker of candlelight on tables set with white linens. Classical music drifted out when someone opened the door. Vivaldi, I thought, though Leonard had always been the one who could name the composers. I checked my watch. 6:30 exactly. Imani had always appreciated punctuality, a trait she'd inherited from her father, along with his stubborn streak and his brilliant smile. The hostess was a young woman with kind eyes and an easy warmth. "Good evening. Welcome to Franco's. I'm meeting my daughter, Imani Washington." "Oh yes, she's already here. Right this way." She led me through the restaurant, past couples leaning close over wine glasses, past a family celebrating what looked like a graduation, past all the normal people living their normal lives, unaware that at table 12 in the corner, a mother was about to discover just how far a daughter could fall. Imani was already seated, and for a moment, seeing her there in the candlelight, I felt my breath catch. She was radiant in the way only pregnant women can be, her skin glowing with that particular luminescence, her dark hair falling in loose waves around her shoulders. She wore a dress I didn't recognize, something designer probably, in a deep emerald green that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in 2 months. "Mama." She stood to embrace me, and for that moment, breathing in her familiar perfume, the same Chanel number 5. I'd bought her for her 21st birthday. I felt the familiar surge of maternal love that had defined my existence for 34 years. Whatever else was true, whatever problems lay between us, she was still my daughter. Still the baby I'd rocked through colicky nights and the toddler who'd clung to my leg on the first day of preschool, and the teenager who'd cried on my shoulder when her first boyfriend broke her heart. "You look beautiful, sweetheart," I said, meaning it. Whatever our differences, whatever pain lay between us, that was true. How are you feeling? Any morning sickness? Better now. She touched her belly with a gesture that was both protective and possessive. They say the second trimester is supposed to be easier. Devin should be here any minute. He got held up at the office. Devin Brooks, 36 years old, commercial real estate, always impeccably dressed and perfectly coiffed. I'd tried to like him when Imani first brought him home 2 years ago. Tried to see what she saw beyond the expensive suits and the practiced charm and the way he talked about maximizing opportunities and leveraging assets, like life was just one big business deal waiting to be closed. But there were things I'd noticed. Small things that accumulated like dust in corners. The way he'd asked, seemingly casually, about the value of our old family home before I downsized. The way he'd mentioned, just in passing, that people my age often found assisted living less stressful than managing their own properties. The way his eyes had moved around my duplex that first visit, not seeing the home I'd carefully furnished with pieces that held memories, but seeing square footage and potential market value. I'm glad you called, I said, settling into my chair across from her. The table was small, intimate, set for 3. I've missed you, baby. These past 3 weeks. I know, Mama. She looked down at her hands, and I saw something flicker across her face. Guilt? Regret? But before I could identify it, before I could reach across the table and take her hand and tell her that we could work this out, that we could find a way forward, Devin appeared. But he wasn't alone. Following behind him were 3 men in dark suits, each carrying a briefcase, moving with the purposeful stride of people who had places to be and business to conduct. They approached our small table like it was a conference room, like this intimate corner of Franco's was just another venue for negotiation. My stomach tightened as I recognized what was happening. The choreography of their arrival, the timing, the way Imani suddenly couldn't meet my eyes, this wasn't coincidence. This was planned. This was orchestrated. Mrs. Washington. Devin's smile was too bright, too practiced, the smile of a salesman who'd already counted his commission. Thank you for joining us. The 3 men took seats around our table, pulling chairs from nearby empties, transforming our dinner for 3 into what felt unmistakably like an ambush. The other diners glanced over, probably wondering what kind of business meeting happened at Franco's on a Tuesday night. Imani, I said carefully, keeping my voice level despite the alarm bells ringing in my head. Who are these gentlemen? Mama, these are some colleagues of Devin's. Her voice was steady, but she still wouldn't look at me. They have some paperwork they'd like you to look at. One of the men leaned forward. He was older, maybe 60, with silver hair styled precisely and eyes that reminded me of a hawk sizing up prey. Mrs. Washington, I'm Richard Sterling, Devin's attorney. We've prepared some documents that we believe will be beneficial for everyone involved. Attorney, the word hung in the air like smoke from a fire I hadn't known was burning. What kind of documents? I asked, though I already knew this conversation would end badly. I could feel it in the tightness returning to my chest. The same sensation I'd felt 3 weeks ago when Imani had first made her demands. But this time, instead of hurt and anger, I felt something colder settling over me, something that had been crystallizing during those 3 weeks of silence. Devin cleared his throat, that gesture men make when they're about to say something they've rehearsed. It's really quite simple, Mrs. Washington. We're asking you to sign a power of attorney that would allow us to manage your financial affairs. Given your age and the fact that you're living alone now, it just makes sense to have someone younger handling your investments, your property decisions. My age? I repeated the words quietly, letting them sit on the table between us. I'm 62, Devin, not 92. Of course, of course. His tone was patronizing, the voice you'd use with a child who didn't understand the grown-ups were trying to help. But you have to admit, these things are complex. Real estate markets, investment portfolios, tax implications. It's not something you should have to worry about at this stage of your life. I looked at Imani, waiting for her to speak, to explain, to show some sign that this wasn't her idea, that her fiancé had somehow pressured her into this ambush. But she sat silent, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the tablecloth like it held the answers to questions she didn't want to ask. Richard Sterling pushed a manila folder across the table, sliding it past the breadbasket and the flickering votive candle. If you could just sign here and initial there, we can get everything squared away tonight. Make it official. Then you won't have to worry about any of these financial burdens anymore. I opened the folder, though I already knew what I'd find. My years working as a secretary at Morrison & Associates had taught me to recognize legal documents, to spot the language that looked helpful but hid hooks. Power of attorney forms that would give Devin and Imani control over my bank accounts, my house, my insurance policies, everything Leonard and I had worked 40 years to build. Everything I'd protected and preserved and planned to pass on to my children when the time came. Not now, not like this. Not as a prize to be seized by a man who saw my daughter as a pathway to easy money. "And if I don't sign?" I asked, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening in my chest. Imani finally looked up, and the expression in her eyes was one I'd never seen before. Cold, calculating. Final, the eyes of a stranger wearing my daughter's face. "Then you won't see your grandson grow up, Mama." She said it simply, matter-of-factly, like she was discussing the weather. "It's your choice. But I think you should know that Devin and I have been talking to a lawyer about grandparents' rights in Indiana. Apparently, they're quite limited, especially when the grandparent has shown a pattern of being difficult." The restaurant seemed to fade around me, the Vivaldi playing softly in the background, the clink of wine glasses, the murmur of other diners enjoying their Tuesday evening. It all became white noise. I stared at my daughter, this woman I'd carried for 9 months, nursed through midnight fevers, celebrated through every milestone, and tried to understand when exactly she'd become someone I didn't recognize. When had the little girl who brought me dandelions transformed into this woman who could threaten me with my own grandchild? When had the daughter who used to crawl into bed with me during thunderstorms become someone who could sit across from me at Franco's and deliver ultimatums written by lawyers? "I see," I said quietly. I reached into my purse, past my wallet, past my reading glasses, past the small photo of Imani and Jamal that I'd carried for years, both of them laughing, their faces pressed together, taken the summer before Leonard got sick. My fingers found my phone, and I scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I needed. "Mama," Imani's voice had a note of uncertainty now, the first crack in her facade. "What are you doing?" I pressed the call button and waited for the familiar voice to answer. "Hello, Jamal. It's Mama. I need you to come to Franco's restaurant on Meridian Street. Now." I paused, hearing his immediate concern, his questions. "Yes, I know it's late. I know you have work in the morning. Just come, baby, please." I ended the call and placed the phone carefully on the table beside the manila folder, beside the bread basket, beside the guttering candle that seemed to flicker in rhythm with my heartbeat. "I think," I said, looking directly at Imani, "that before I sign anything, your brother might want to say a few words." The silence that followed stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Devin shifted in his seat, his confident facade showing hairline cracks around the edges. The 3 lawyers exchanged glances, the kind of look seasoned predators share when their prey doesn't behave as expected when the rabbit suddenly shows teeth. Richard Sterling cleared his throat. "Mrs. Washington, there's really no need to involve—" "My son?" I finished for him. "My son in a family discussion about my finances, about my future, about whether I'm competent to manage my own affairs?" I kept my voice level, almost pleasant. "How interesting that you think my children shouldn't both be present for that conversation." 23 minutes. That's how long it would take Jamal to drive from his apartment downtown if he hit the lights right and didn't get stuck behind the evening traffic on Meridian. 23 minutes during which I had to navigate this minefield without stepping on the explosives my daughter had so carefully arranged. Imani was watching me now with something that might have been uncertainty, might have been calculation. "Mama, there's no need to make this difficult. This is about your well-being, about making sure you're taken care of." "Taken care of?" I repeated. "Is that what we're calling this?" "Mrs. Washington," Richard Sterling said, deploying what I'm sure he thought was a reassuring smile. "Perhaps we should discuss this more privately. Family matters can be emotional, and can they?" I met his gaze directly. "How thoughtful of you to notice." 23 minutes. I needed to hold this position for 23 minutes. I'd held harder positions for longer. I'd held Leonard's hand for 6 hours during his final night, watching the cancer take him breath by breath. I'd held myself together through the funeral, through the long months of grief, through the process of rebuilding a life I'd never imagined living alone. I could hold this table for 23 minutes. Devin leaned forward, deploying his salesman smile, the one I'm sure closed deals and charmed clients. "Look, Mrs. Washington. Loretta, may I call you Loretta?" "You may call me Mrs. Washington." His smile flickered, reset. Of course. Mrs. Washington, I think there's been a misunderstanding. We're not trying to take anything from you. We just want to help you manage your assets more efficiently. You know, maximize your returns, make sure you're positioned well for the long term. I see. I folded my hands on the table. And how much would this help cost me? I'm sorry? Your help, managing my assets efficiently. What's your fee? The lawyers stirred slightly, like birds ruffling feathers. Devon's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. There would be some administrative costs, naturally, but really this is about family, about making sure Imani and the baby are secure. The baby! I turned to my daughter, who was studying her manicured nails with sudden intensity. Tell me, Imani, when exactly did you start planning this evening? Mama, I don't know what you mean. When did you call Devon's lawyer friends? Before or after you called me about reconciliation? She lifted her chin, and there was Leonard's stubborn streak, twisted into something I didn't recognize, something that would have broken his heart. Does it matter? It matters to me. Fine. The word came out sharp, brittle as old glass. We've been discussing options for weeks, ever since you made it clear that you don't care about my happiness or my future. Options, I say, she said, tasting the word, finding it bitter. Is that what we're calling extortion now? It's not extortion. Imani's voice rose, drawing glances from nearby tables. It's family. It's what families do for each other. What families do, I said quietly, is support each other without lawyers and ultimatums. The youngest of the three attorneys, a nervous-looking man who couldn't be more than 30, leaned forward. Mrs. Washington, if I may, you should know that grandparents' rights in Indiana are quite limited. If your daughter chooses to restrict your access to her child, your legal recourse would be— Excuse me. The voice came from behind me, familiar and warm as summer. I turned to see Jamal standing beside our table, still wearing his hospital scrubs, his dark hair mussed from what had obviously been a rushed drive. At 37, my son had inherited his father's steady presence and his grandmother's sharp eyes that missed nothing. I'm Dr. Washington, he said to the table in general, though his gaze lingered on Devon and the three lawyers. I believe you called me, Mama. I did, baby. I gestured to an empty chair the hostess had quickly provided. Jamal, I'd like you to meet your sister's colleagues. My son's eyes swept the table, taking in the lawyers, the manila folder, the tension so thick you could cut it with a butter knife. As an emergency room physician at Methodist Hospital, he'd learned to assess situations quickly, to read a room and understand what kind of crisis he was walking into. I watched him catalog every detail with the precision that had made him one of the youngest department heads the hospital had ever appointed. Colleagues, he repeated slowly. I see. And from the way he said it, I knew he did see. He saw everything. Devon stood extending his hand with the practiced smoothness of a man accustomed to making good first impressions. Jamal, good to see you again. I'm sorry to pull you away from work. These are some business associates of mine, Richard Sterling, Trevor Kane, and Darnell Hughes. We were just discussing some financial planning with your mother. Jamal shook Devon's hand briefly, professionally, the way you might shake hands with someone you'd just met in a hospital corridor. Then he sat down without acknowledging the lawyers, his attention focused entirely on Imani. Financial planning, he said, at Franco's, on a Tuesday night, with you 3 months pregnant. He paused, and I could see him shifting into that clinical assessment mode, the one he used when a patient came into the ER with a story that didn't quite match their injuries. How are you feeling, by the way? Any complications? I'm fine, Jamal. Imani's voice was smaller now, less certain. The presence of her brother seemed to have deflated something in her posture. Good, that's good. Jamal picked up the manila folder, flipped through it with the casual expertise of someone who'd reviewed plenty of legal documents during his years in medicine. Malpractice insurance, hospital contracts, patient consent forms. Power of attorney. Interesting. He looked up at me. Mama, did you ask for help managing your finances? I did not. He closed the folder, set it aside like it was contaminated. Devon, Imani, gentlemen, would you mind giving me a moment alone with my mother? Now wait just a minute, Devon started, but Jamal's voice cut through his objection like a scalpel through skin. I'm not asking. There was something in my son's tone, the same quiet authority he used when dealing with difficult patients or uncooperative family members in the emergency room, that made the lawyers shift uncomfortably in their chairs. It was the voice of a man who'd seen every con, every manipulation, every desperate attempt to game the system, and had learned to recognize them all. Devon looked to Imani for support, but she was staring at her hands again, her fingers twisting together in her lap. Richard Sterling stood, smoothing his expensive suit. "We'll be right over there," he said, gesturing toward the bar area. "Mrs. Washington, please don't make any hasty decisions without considering all the implications." After they'd moved away, the three lawyers clustering at the bar, Devon hovering near them but keeping his eyes on our table, Imani sitting frozen in her chair, Jamal leaned forward, lowering his voice to the level we'd used when Leonard was in his final days, and we needed to discuss hard things without him hearing. "Mama, talk to me. What's really going on here?" For the first time that evening, I felt tears threaten. Not tears of sadness or fear, but tears of relief. Relief that at least one of my children still saw me as a person rather than a resource to be managed. Relief that I'd raised at least one human being who understood that love wasn't measured in dollar signs and power of attorney documents. "They want me to sign over power of attorney," I said, my voice steady despite the emotion pressing against my chest. "Imani says if I don't, I won't see my grandchild." Jamal was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the white tablecloth in a rhythm I remembered from his childhood, something he'd done when he was thinking hard, working through a complex problem the way he'd work through a difficult diagnosis. "How much did they originally ask you for? For the wedding?" $65,000. He whistled low, a sound that carried both disbelief and a kind of bitter confirmation. "And you offered?" $15,000, which is more than generous. More than your father and I spent on our entire wedding and honeymoon combined." "More than generous," he agreed. He glanced toward the bar where Devon was gesticulating to the lawyers, probably explaining why this family meeting wasn't going according to plan, why the old woman was being difficult, why she didn't understand what was best for her. "Mama, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "Of course, baby. Are you having any problems? Memory issues, confusion, difficulty managing your bills or your household? Anything that might make them think, even wrongly, that you need help managing your affairs?" I almost laughed, except nothing about this situation was funny. "Jamal, last month I balanced my checkbook to the penny, renegotiated my car insurance and saved $200 a year, and caught an error in my property tax assessment that saved me $800. Does that sound like someone who needs financial management?" "No, Mama, it doesn't." His jaw tightened in a way that reminded me so much of Leonard when he was truly angry, not the quick flash of irritation, but the deep, cold fury that came from witnessing genuine injustice. "It sounds like someone who taught her son how to manage money so well that he graduated medical school with minimal debt while most of his classmates are drowning in it. You worked for that degree, baby. I worked for it because you taught me the value of work. You showed me how to sacrifice for what matters without sacrificing who you are." He looked toward Imani, who was watching us from across the restaurant with an expression I couldn't quite read. Fear, maybe, or regret, or just the dawning realization that her carefully laid plan was coming apart at the seams. "What happened to her, Mama? When did she become this person?" It was the question I'd been asking myself for months, maybe years. When had my daughter's healthy ambition curdled into this sense of entitlement? When had her dreams transformed into demands? When had her love become conditional on what I could provide rather than who I was? "I don't know," I admitted. "Maybe I protected her too much. Maybe I made things too easy for her. Or maybe Devon happened to her," Jamal finished. I followed his gaze to where my daughter's fiancé was now on his phone, his voice animated even though I couldn't hear the words, his free hand cutting through the air in sharp, aggressive gestures. "I think he's a man who sees an opportunity and doesn't much care who gets hurt in the pursuit of it." "You think he's behind this?" "I think," Jamal said carefully, "that Imani is 34 years old and responsible for her own choices. The question is, what do you want to do about it?" Before I could answer, Devon was striding back toward our table, the lawyers trailing behind him like a well-dressed wake, Imani following more slowly with one hand pressed to her stomach in a gesture that was either protective or performative. I could no longer tell the difference. "I'm sorry to interrupt this family moment," Devon said, not sounding sorry at all, "but we do have a timeline we're working with here. The wedding is in 3 months, and there are vendors who need deposits, venues that need to be secured. We can't afford to wait indefinitely for decisions to be made." "Of course," I said, standing up slowly, deliberately, taking my time. Around us, the restaurant continued its evening rhythm, couples sharing wine, families celebrating, friends catching up over pasta. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that at table 12 in the corner, a family was being systematically dismantled with the efficiency of a demolition crew. Timeline, I continued, checking my purse to make sure my phone was easily accessible. How thoughtful of you to mention that, Devin. Because you're absolutely right. Decisions do need to be made. Amani's face went very still, like she was holding her breath. I smiled. The same smile I'd worn to countless PTA meetings when dealing with teachers who underestimated other people's children. The same smile I'd perfected during 40 years of marriage to a man who occasionally tested my patience, but never my loyalty. The same smile I'd deployed in 100 difficult situations when I needed people to underestimate me just a little bit longer. I've made my decision, I said, loud enough for everyone at our table to hear clearly. The relief that washed over Devin's face was almost comical. Richard Sterling actually smiled, a genuine expression of satisfaction. Even Amani seemed to relax slightly, her shoulders dropping as if she'd been carrying a heavy weight. But first, I continued, reaching for my phone, there's someone else who wants to say a few words. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I'd added just 2 weeks ago, a precaution I'd taken after Amani's first ultimatum, when a mother's intuition had whispered that this reconciliation dinner might be anything but reconciling. Brenda? It's Loretta Washington. Yes, I know it's late. I'm sorry to bother you. Could you come to Franco's restaurant on Meridian Street? I paused, listening to her immediate agreement, her quick professional assessment that if I was calling, I needed her. Yes. Please bring the documents we discussed. I set the phone down carefully on the table, noting with satisfaction how the simple act of making a phone call could change the entire energy of a room. The lawyers were whispering among themselves now, quick urgent consultations. Devin's expression had shifted from relief to confusion to something approaching alarm. Amani was looking between Devin and me with growing unease, like a child who'd started a game and was only now realizing she didn't know all the rules. Who is Brenda? Devin asked, his voice tight. I looked at him directly, letting him see that I was done playing whatever game he thought we were playing. Brenda Patterson, my attorney. The silence that followed was different from the earlier silences. This one was heavier, more dangerous, like the atmospheric pressure drop before a tornado. Richard Sterling's predatory smile had vanished entirely, replaced by the sharp focus of a hunter who'd suddenly realized he might be the one being hunted. Your attorney, Devin repeated slowly, like he was testing the words for traps. When did you hire an attorney? The same day you started asking my neighbors about my mental state, I replied, watching his face carefully, noting every micro-expression that crossed it. Did you really think Mrs. Anderson wouldn't mention that a nice young man had stopped by asking whether I'd been acting strangely lately? Whether I'd been forgetting things, making poor decisions? Imani's face went pale, the healthy glow of pregnancy draining away. Mama, we never what, sweetheart? I kept my voice gentle, almost maternal, which somehow made it worse. Never had Devin drive through my neighborhood 3 weeks ago, taking pictures of my house from different angles. Never had him chat with my mailman, asking whether I'd been paying my bills on time. Never had his friend from the real estate office, what was his name, Trevor, pull comparable sales on my property to see what it might sell for. Jamal leaned back in his chair, and I could see him putting the pieces together with the rapid assessment skills that made him excellent at emergency medicine. Jesus, Imani, how long have you been planning this? It's not what you think, she said, but her voice lacked conviction, lacked the righteous certainty she'd had just minutes ago. Isn't it? I opened my purse and pulled out a small manila envelope, not the one they'd brought, but my own. Because I think it's exactly what it looks like. A systematic attempt to establish grounds for claiming I'm incompetent to manage my own affairs. I spread the contents of the envelope across the table, watching their faces as they registered what they were seeing. Photographs that Devin had taken of my house, printed out and annotated. Copies of emails between him and a private investigator named Marcus Chen. Copies of inquiries he'd made about my medical records at Dr. Okoye's office, my banking habits at First National, my daily routines as reported by various neighbors he'd chatted up over the past month. Brenda has been very thorough, I explained as the lawyers examined the documents with growing discomfort, their professional confidence cracking like ice over a thawing pond. It's amazing what people will tell a private investigator, isn't it? especially when that investigator looks like someone's sweet grandmother and knows exactly how to ask questions that sound like innocent concern. Trevor Kane, the youngest of the three lawyers, was actually sweating now, small beads of perspiration appearing on his forehead, despite the restaurant's comfortable temperature. "Mrs. Washington, I think there may have been some misunderstanding about our client's intentions." "Oh, I understand the intentions perfectly," I interrupted, gathering the papers back into a neat stack. "The question is whether you gentlemen understood what you were being asked to participate in, whether you performed adequate due diligence before agreeing to ambush a 62-year-old widow in a restaurant with power of attorney documents, whether you considered that maybe, just maybe, there was a reason your client wanted this done in a restaurant instead of an office, quickly instead of carefully, with pressure instead of process." Richard Sterling's face had gone carefully neutral, the expression of a lawyer who just realized he might be on the wrong side of a malpractice claim. "Mrs. Washington, if there's been any impropriety, I let the word hang in the air. Brenda Patterson arrived exactly 12 minutes later, striding through Franco's with the purposeful energy of a woman who'd spent 30 years practicing family law and had seen every variation of human greed and manipulation. At 70, she was small and silver-haired, dressed in a perfectly tailored pantsuit that probably cost more than my entire month's budget. But it was her eyes that made opposing counsel uncomfortable. Sharp, intelligent, missing absolutely nothing. "Loretta," she said warmly, settling into the chair Jamal had procured from a nearby table. She turned to my daughter with a professional smile that somehow conveyed both courtesy and complete tactical advantage. "And this must be Imani. I've heard so much about you." The contrast was immediate and devastating. Where I had been isolated at this table, surrounded by predators circling for the kill, Brenda's presence shifted the balance entirely. Suddenly, Devin and his lawyers were outnumbered by people who actually understood the law, who'd spent decades protecting people like me from people like them. "Gentlemen," Brenda said, surveying the group with the clinical assessment of a surgeon examining a particularly interesting tumor, "I believe you have some documents you'd like Mrs. Washington to sign?" Richard Sterling cleared his throat, regrouping. "This is really a family matter, Ms. Patterson. I'm not sure your presence is—" "Brenda Patterson of Patterson & Associates," she interrupted smoothly. "And you're quite right, Mr. Sterling. This is a family matter, which is why I'm here to ensure that Mrs. Washington's family relationships aren't being exploited for financial gain." She opened her own briefcase, removing a thick folder with the calm efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. "Now, before we discuss any power of attorney arrangements, I think you should see what Mrs. Washington has already put in place." The papers she spread across the table were pristine, official, bearing the raised seal of the Marion County Courthouse. As Devin leaned forward to read them, I watched his face change from confusion to understanding to something approaching panic, each emotion playing across his features like a time-lapse of dawning horror. "Irrevocable trust," Brenda explained conversationally, her tone pleasant as if she were discussing the weather or the excellent Ossobuco Franco's was known for. "Established 2 weeks ago, immediately after Mrs. Washington consulted with me regarding some concerning behavior from her daughter's fiancé." "That's—" Devin started, then stopped, his legal knowledge apparently insufficient for the situation he found himself in. "That's what, dear?" Brenda asked sweetly, with the kind of dangerous politeness that had probably terrified opposing counsel for 3 decades. Imani had moved closer, reading over Devin's shoulder, her face growing paler with each line of legal text. "The trust," she said slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "It says the beneficiaries are your children. Both born and unborn," I finished, watching her process this, "with Jamal as the trustee until they reach the age of 25. The implications hit Devin like a physical blow. I could actually see him calculating, recalculating, trying to find an angle, a loophole, some way to still access the money he'd been counting on. His face went through several expressions in rapid succession: shock, anger, calculation, and finally a kind of desperate fury. "But what about the wedding?" he demanded, his voice rising. "What about our expenses? What about the life we're trying to build?" "What about them?" Brenda asked, her tone genuinely curious, as if she couldn't fathom why this was confusing to him. "The trust," Imani read aloud, her voice shaking, "provides for educational expenses, medical care, and reasonable living costs for the beneficiaries." She looked up at me. "For my children." "That's correct," Brenda confirmed. The trust will ensure that your children, including the baby you're carrying now, will have access to the finest education, the best medical care, every opportunity a grandparent could want to provide. Music lessons, sports equipment, college tuition, graduate school if they choose. All funded, all protected, all managed by a trustee who has only their best interests at heart. She turned to Devin with a smile that could freeze water. However, I don't see how an Italian marble bathroom renovation qualifies as an educational or medical expense for a child who hasn't been born yet. Do you, Mr. Brooks? This is ridiculous. Devin's composure was finally cracking, his voice loud enough to draw concerned glances from other diners. Imani, tell them. Tell them we had an agreement. Tell them about the promises your mother made. Did you? Jamal asked his sister quietly, his disappointment more cutting than any anger could have been. Did you have an agreement? Or did you have demands backed by threats? Imani looked around the table, at Devin's angry face, red now with frustration and rage, at the lawyers who were already calculating how to distance themselves from this disaster, their eyes darting toward the exit, at Jamal's expression of profound disappointment, at Brenda's professional calm, and finally, at me. I'm pregnant, she said, as if that explained everything, as if that justified everything. We need security. We need to know our child will be provided for. The baby card, her last play, the ace she'd been holding, thinking it was unbeatable. Your child will be provided for, I said gently, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. Better than you can imagine, sweetheart. The trust will pay for everything a child could need. The finest schools, the best doctors, music lessons and sports teams and summer camps and college tuition. Every opportunity Leonard and I wanted for our grandchildren. I paused, letting that sink in, letting her understand what she'd almost thrown away. But Devin won't have access to a penny of it. You can't do this. Devin was standing now, his hands flat on the table, leaning forward like he might physically intimidate us into compliance. Imani is your daughter. You can't cut her out of your will over a goddamn wedding. That's not how families work. I'm not cutting her out of anything, I replied calmly. I'm protecting her inheritance from you. Brenda smiled then, the kind of smile that had probably terrified opposing counsel for 3 decades, the expression of a chess master who'd been playing 10 moves ahead the entire game. Mr. Brooks, perhaps you'd like to call your own attorney, because I think you might need some independent legal advice about the implications of what we've discovered regarding your premarital investigation of your fiancé's mother. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Elder abuse, financial exploitation, harassment, all words that could end a career in commercial real estate, could destroy a reputation, could turn ambition into disgrace. Richard Sterling was already gathering his papers, his professional instincts screaming at him to get as far away from this situation as possible. I think, he said carefully, his voice carrying the measured tones of damage control, that we may have been operating under some misunderstandings about the nature of this situation. Perhaps it would be best if we postponed any document signing until everyone has had time to consult with their respective counsel, in separate meetings, with full disclosure. Excellent idea, Brenda agreed pleasantly. Mrs. Washington, shall we go? I think you've accomplished what you came here to do. I stood slowly, taking my time, letting the weight of what had just happened settle over the table like dust after an explosion. Imani was crying now, silent tears running down her cheeks. Whether they were tears of genuine grief or calculated manipulation, I found I no longer cared. The time for trying to parse her true feelings had passed somewhere between the ambush and the ultimatum. Imani, I said softly, and she looked up with something that might have been hope flickering in her eyes. When you're ready to have a real conversation about this baby, about your future, about what family actually means, call me. I let that offer sit for a moment before adding the condition that made it real. But call me alone. I turned to Devin, who was staring at the trust documents as if he could change their contents through sheer force of will, as if this was just another deal that needed a better sales pitch. As for you, I said, my voice carrying the authority of a woman who had spent 62 years learning how to recognize predators in every form they took. Stay away from my family, stay away from my house. And if I hear you've made one more inquiry about my competency or my finances, Brenda and I will have a very different kind of conversation. One that involves words like harassment and elder abuse and fraud. Are we clear? His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. What could he say? His play had failed. His mark had turned out to have teeth. Jamal stood as well, pulling his wallet from his pocket and leaving enough cash on the table to cover whatever drinks had been ordered. "Imani," he said to his sister, his voice carrying both love and boundaries, the balance our parents had tried to teach us. "You're welcome at my place if you need somewhere to think, somewhere to figure out who you want to be and what kind of mother you want to become." He paused, making sure she was listening, making sure she understood. "But you come alone, and you leave the financial scheming at the door." As we walked toward the exit, me, Jamal, and Brenda forming a united front, I could hear Devin's voice rising behind us, arguing with the lawyers, with Imani, with anyone who would listen. Words about fairness and rights and the unfairness of it all, the entitled rage of a man who'd been counting money that was never his to count. The sound followed us out into the cool October evening, where it was absorbed by the vast indifference of the universe, becoming just another complaint lost to the night air. We stood on the sidewalk outside Franco's, the three of us, while other diners came and went, their evenings untouched by drama or betrayal or family dissolution. "How do you feel?" Brenda asked, her professional assessment giving way to genuine concern. I considered the question carefully. Inside the restaurant, my daughter was probably trying to salvage her relationship with a man who had seen her primarily as a pathway to easy money. Inside, Devin was learning that there were still women in the world who couldn't be intimidated or manipulated into surrendering what they'd built. Inside, 3 lawyers were probably regretting the day they'd agreed to participate in an elder abuse scheme disguised as financial planning. "Free," I said finally, tasting the word, finding it sweet. "For the first time in months, Brenda, I feel free." She nodded approvingly, her silver hair catching the street light. "Good. Now comes the hard part." "What's that?" "Deciding what you want to build with that freedom." Jamal put his arm around my shoulders, and for a moment I leaned into my son, this man who'd somehow learned to be better than the world that raised him, who'd learned that love was about protection and boundaries and showing up when it mattered. "Mama," he said quietly, "I'm proud of you. Dad would be proud of you." And standing there on Meridian Street, with my son's arm around me and my attorney beside me and my freedom newly won, I let myself believe it. Leonard would be proud. I'd protected what we'd built. I'd protected it from the people we'd built it for. And if that was tragedy, it was also triumph. 3 weeks later, I stood in my kitchen making coffee for 2, watching the morning sun paint geometric patterns across the linoleum floor Leonard and I had installed 23 years ago. We'd done it ourselves over a long weekend, him cutting the tiles while I measured and laid them out, both of us laughing when we realized we'd miscalculated and had to make a midnight run to Home Depot for more adhesive. The house felt different now, not empty, but peaceful. There was a distinction I was only beginning to understand, the difference between loneliness and solitude, between isolation and independence. For 40 years, I'd defined myself by the people I cared for. Leonard's wife, Imani and Jamal's mother, the woman who made Sunday dinners and remembered everyone's favorite foods and kept photo albums meticulously organized so no memory would be lost. But who was I when I was just Loretta? When I wasn't performing the role of mother or widow or potential victim? That was the question I'd been asking myself in the quiet mornings, in the peaceful evenings, in all the spaces that used to be filled with worry about Imani and fear about the future. The doorbell rang at exactly 9 o'clock, and I smiled. Punctuality. I'd come to appreciate it even more since Franco's, since I'd learned the value of people who said what they meant and did what they promised. "Right on time," I said, opening the door to find Shanice Reynolds holding a covered casserole dish and wearing the kind of smile that suggested she had news to share. "I brought my grandmother's cornbread," Shanice said, sailing past me into the kitchen with the comfortable familiarity of someone who'd become essential to my daily life. "And I heard something interesting at the grocery store yesterday." Shanice had appeared in my life like a small miracle disguised as a coincidence. 2 days after the dinner at Franco's, she'd knocked on my door, introducing herself as my new neighbor in the other half of the duplex, a recent widow who'd downsized after 45 years in the house where she'd raised 4 children, 2 of whom, she'd mentioned with wry humor, had been very disappointed when she'd informed them that her equity was going to fund her own happiness, not their early inheritances. At 67, Shanice was trim and energetic. With silver hair she wore in a practical bob and laugh lines that suggested she'd decided long ago that joy was a choice worth making every day. More importantly, she had a gift for listening without judgment and a complete immunity to other people's drama. What kind of interesting? I asked, pouring coffee into the mugs we'd picked out together at that antique store downtown, part of what Shanice called my reclaiming project, the process of filling my space with things I chose because I liked them, not because they matched some vision of what a widow's home should look like. Devin Brooks was at the bank yesterday, she said, settling into the kitchen chair that had become hers over the past weeks. Apparently, he was quite upset about some accounts being frozen. I sat down across from her, noting how natural this felt, having someone to share morning coffee with, someone who understood that gossip could be a form of justice when it exposed the right truths to the right people. Frozen accounts? Shanice's eyes sparkled with the particular pleasure that came from watching Karma work with efficient precision. Seems his business partner discovered some irregularities in their escrow account. Something about client deposits being used for personal expenses. A nice bathroom renovation, I heard. Italian marble, very expensive. I absorbed this information with the careful neutrality I'd perfected over the past month. Since Franco's, I'd learned that revenge was most satisfying when it was served by someone other than yourself, when the universe simply adjusted itself to reflect the natural consequences of poor choices. "And how is Imani?" I asked, though I wasn't entirely sure I wanted to hear the answer. "Shopping for wedding dresses at the outlets in Greenville," Shanice reported. "Apparently, the Italian marble bathroom renovation has been postponed indefinitely, along with the Maldives honeymoon. I heard something about a small ceremony at a local venue. Very intimate, very affordable." We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, drinking our coffee and listening to the sounds of our neighborhood coming alive. Children walking to school, cars starting, dogs barking, the familiar rhythm of ordinary life continuing despite the small dramas that occasionally disrupted it. "Have you heard from Jamal?" Shanice asked. "Yesterday. He said Imani called him, asking if he thought she was making a mistake." Shanice raised an eyebrow. "And what did he tell her?" "He told her that was a question only she could answer." "Smart man." "He gets that from his father," she said, and for the first time in months, thinking about Leonard didn't bring the familiar stab of grief, just a warm sense of gratitude that I'd had 40 years with a man who'd taught me, by example, what it meant to build something worth protecting. The phone rang, and I felt the familiar tightness in my chest that had become my body's automatic response to unexpected calls. A trauma response, Jamal had explained, completely normal after what I'd been through. But when I checked the display, it showed a number I didn't recognize. Local area code, but not one in my contacts. "Mrs. Washington?" The voice was young, female, nervous. "This is Diana Bennett from the Meridian Community Center. I hope I'm not calling too early." "Not at all. How can I help you?" "Well, this might sound strange, but we heard about your situation from Brenda Patterson. She mentioned that you might be interested in some volunteer opportunities." I looked at Shanice, who was listening with the polite attention of someone who'd learned that other people's phone calls often contained interesting information. "What kind of opportunities?" I asked. "We have a program for seniors who are dealing with financial exploitation," Diana explained, her nervousness giving way to enthusiasm as she warmed to her subject. "People whose families or caregivers are trying to take advantage of them. Brenda thought you might be uniquely qualified to help, given your recent experience and how successfully you navigated it." The irony wasn't lost on me, that my own family crisis might become the foundation for helping others navigate similar treacheries. But there was something appealing about the idea, something that felt like turning poison into medicine, like taking the worst thing that had happened to me and using it to prevent the worst from happening to someone else. "Tell me more," I said. For the next 20 minutes, Diana explained the program. Seniors helping seniors, sharing strategies for recognizing manipulation, resources for legal protection, emotional support for those who'd been betrayed by the people they trusted most. It was part support group, part advocacy organization, part early warning system for a community that was increasingly targeted by sophisticated scammers, both professional and familial. "We meet Tuesday evenings at 7, Diana concluded. "Very informal, coffee and conversation mostly. But we've helped quite a few people avoid situations like what Brenda described happened to you." "I'll think about it," I said, though I was already thinking about it, already imagining myself in a room full of people who understood the particular pain of being seen as a resource rather than a person. After I hung up, Shanice was looking at me with the expression of someone who'd recognized something significant. "You're going to do it," she said. It wasn't a question. "Probably." "Good. You need something that's yours, something that has nothing to do with being anyone's mother or grandmother or potential victim. It was exactly the right thing to say, delivered with the matter-of-fact wisdom that had made Shanice such an unexpected gift in my life. She understood transformation not as a dramatic reinvention, but as a gradual reclaiming of space that had always belonged to you. The afternoon brought another call, this one from Jamal. Mama, I wanted to give you a heads up. Imani's been asking questions about the trust, specifically about whether there are any ways to modify it. I felt a familiar stirring of anger, but it was different now. Cleaner, more focused. Not the helpless rage of someone being attacked, but the purposeful irritation of someone whose boundaries were being tested. And? I told her that irrevocable means irrevocable, but she seems to think there might be loopholes. She mentioned something about undue influence, about Brenda pressuring you into decisions you might not have made otherwise. Let me guess, I said. Devon's idea? Probably. But Mama, he paused, and I could hear the weight of what he was about to say. She's the one making the calls. She's the one who chose to pursue this. I need you to understand that. I know, baby. There's something else. His voice was careful, the tone he used when delivering bad news to patients' families. She asked if I thought you'd change your mind if she ended the engagement. The calculation was so transparent it was almost insulting. Dump Devon. Get the money. As if my objection had been to him personally, rather than to the systematic exploitation they'd attempted together. What did you tell her? I told her that decisions motivated by money rarely lead to happiness, but that her relationship with Devon wasn't really my business. He paused. I also told her that if she wanted to repair things with you, it would have to start with an honest conversation about what she'd done and why she'd done it. Not excuses, not justifications, just honesty. And? She hung up on me. I absorbed this information with the same calm acceptance I'd brought to every revelation of the past month. Each piece of evidence that Imani had chosen Devon, chosen money, chosen manipulation over family, simply confirmed what I already knew, that my daughter had become someone I didn't recognize, and that protecting myself from her choices was not cruelty, but necessity. Jamal, I said, I want you to know that whatever happens with Imani, it doesn't change anything between us. You're a good man and a good son, and I'm proud of the life you've built. Mama, his voice was thick with emotion. I keep thinking I should be able to fix this somehow. Mediate. Find some middle ground. Some things can't be fixed, sweetheart. Some things can only be accepted. After we hung up, I walked through my house slowly, looking at it with new eyes. The living room where Imani had played with dolls and later brought boyfriends for my approval. The kitchen where I'd taught her to make pie crust and where she'd announced her engagement to Devon. The hallway lined with family photos that suddenly seemed like documentation of a story that had ended. But endings, I was learning, were also beginnings. Tomorrow, I would call Diana Bennett and volunteer for the community center program. Next week, Shanice and I were driving to Nashville to visit the museum she'd wanted to see since her husband died, but had never felt comfortable going to alone. Next month, Brenda and I were meeting to discuss starting a financial literacy program for women my age who'd never managed money independently, who'd gone straight from their fathers' houses to their husbands without ever learning to navigate the financial world on their own terms. The future stretched ahead of me like an uncharted road, and for the first time in years, I was genuinely curious about where it might lead. 6 months after Franco's, I stood in the Meridian Community Center's main hall, watching 12 women and 3 men arrange folding chairs in a circle. At 72, Maxine Robinson moved with the purposeful energy of someone who'd spent her retirement years discovering that age was just another challenge to overcome. Rosa Kelly, barely 60 but carrying the exhaustion of someone who'd been fighting her son's gambling addiction for years, carefully placed tissues on the small table in the center of our circle, a practical gesture that acknowledged the tears that often accompanied our Tuesday evening meetings. First-timer over by the door, Shanice murmured, settling into the chair beside mine. She'd started attending the meetings 3 weeks after I did, claiming she wanted to learn how to spot the warning signs of financial exploitation. What she'd really wanted was to support me. But Shanice had a gift for making practical altruism seem like mere curiosity. I followed her gaze to where a new woman sat uncertainly near the exit, clutching her purse like a shield. She was perhaps 55, well-dressed in the careful way of someone who'd once had money and was now learning to dress on a budget. Her hair was perfectly styled, but I could see the telltale signs of stress in the way she held her shoulders, the slight tremor in her hands when she adjusted her purse strap. First time, I agreed, recognizing the particular brand of shell-shocked dignity that accompanied people to their first meeting. I'll talk to her after. The past 6 months had taught me that there were as many ways to be financially exploited as there were families willing to rationalize theft as love. I'd heard stories that made Imani's demands seem almost quaint. Children who'd forged their parents' signatures on reverse mortgages. Grandchildren who'd used their grandparents' credit cards to fund drug habits. Spouses who'd systematically emptied joint accounts while their partners struggled with dementia or cancer, leaving them with nothing. But I'd also witnessed recoveries that proved the human capacity for rebuilding was far stronger than the capacity for destruction. Brenda had become something of a legend in our group, having helped 17 people establish protective trusts, prosecuted 2 cases of elder abuse, and recovered nearly $200,000 in stolen assets. "Good evening, everyone," I said, calling the meeting to order with the natural authority I'd discovered in myself over the past months. For our newcomers, I'm Loretta Washington, and this is our weekly gathering for people who've experienced financial exploitation by family members. The words still carried a sting, but it was the clean pain of a healing wound rather than the infected agony of a fresh betrayal. I'd learned to own my story, to tell it without shame, to use it as a tool for helping others recognize their own worth. Tonight we're going to talk about what comes after, I continued. After you've protected yourself, after you've set boundaries, after you've stopped the immediate threat. What comes next? It was a question I could finally answer with authority because I'd lived it. The immediate aftermath of Franco's had been about damage control and legal protection, but the real work had been quieter, more personal, learning to trust my own judgment again, rebuilding relationships that mattered, discovering who I was when I wasn't defending myself against attack. For me, said Eddie Thompson, a 78-year-old former teacher whose daughter had been systematically draining his retirement account to fund her boyfriend's construction business. What came next was realizing I could live alone and like it, that I didn't need someone taking care of me just because I was old. Hell, I'm sharper now than I was at 50. Nods around the circle. Independence was a common theme in our group, not the fierce isolation that came from being hurt, but the satisfied solitude that came from choosing your own company over toxic relationships. I learned I didn't have to forgive anyone, added Sheila Morrison, whose son had stolen her identity to open credit cards in her name, racking up $40,000 in debt before she'd discovered it. That was big for me. Everyone kept saying I had to forgive him because he was family, because he was sick, because addiction is a disease. But Dr. Washington, Jamal, he helped me understand that forgiveness isn't mandatory for healing. My son had become an unofficial counselor to our group, stopping by once a month to discuss the psychological aspects of family financial abuse. His insights had helped me understand that my guilt over Imani wasn't maternal failure. It was a normal response to an abnormal situation, a healthy person's reaction to unhealthy behavior. "What about you, Loretta?" asked Carolyn Davis, the newest regular in our group, a woman whose husband had convinced her to sign over her inheritance to fund his investment opportunities that turned out to be nothing more than gambling debts. "What came after for you?" I considered the question, looking around the circle at faces that had become familiar, dear even. These people had seen me cry, rage, doubt myself, and gradually find my footing again. They'd earned an honest answer. "Purpose," I said finally. For 40 years, my purpose was being a wife and mother. After Leonard died, I thought my purpose was protecting what we'd built so I could pass it on to my children. But what came after was discovering that my real purpose might be protecting other people's mothers from what I went through. It was true. The volunteer work had evolved into something larger, a consulting practice where I helped other women navigate family financial crises. Brenda had referred several clients to me, and I'd discovered I had a talent for spotting manipulation tactics and helping people develop strategies for resistance without destroying themselves in the process. "How do you handle the sadness?" asked the new woman, speaking for the first time. Her voice was soft, cultured, carrying the particular sadness of someone whose worldview had been fundamentally altered. "How do you stop missing who they used to be?" The question hit the center of something I'd been avoiding, a truth I hadn't wanted to face even in the safety of this circle. Because the reality was, I did miss Imani. Not the manipulative woman she'd become, not the daughter who'd threatened me with my own grandchild, but the little girl who'd brought me dandelions. The teenager who'd called me crying about boys and fashion disasters and friendship drama. The young woman who'd been genuinely proud of her parents' marriage, who'd said she wanted what Leonard and I had. I don't think you stopped missing them, I admitted. I think you learned to mourn them while protecting yourself from them. It's possible to grieve someone who's still alive. The meeting continued for another hour, covering practical matters, new legal resources, upcoming workshops, success stories from former members who'd reclaimed their lives and rebuilt their relationships with the adult children who'd finally understood what they'd almost lost. But that question about missing them lingered, following me home to the duplex where Shanice was waiting with leftover soup and the latest update on her own complicated family dynamics. "How was group?" she asked, settling into what had become her chair at my kitchen table. "Good. Hard." A new woman asked about missing the people our families used to be. Shanice nodded slowly. "Speaking of missing people," she said carefully, "Jamal called while you were out. Imani had her baby." The words hit me like a physical blow, even though I'd been expecting them for weeks. The due date had been circled on my calendar, marked in red like a deadline I was racing toward or running from. I'd never been quite sure which. "How is she?" I asked, though I wasn't sure if I meant Imani or the baby. "Everyone's healthy. 7 pounds, 2 ounces. They named her Eleanor." Eleanor, my mother's name. The manipulation was so transparent, so calculated that I felt momentarily dizzy with the audacity of it. My mother, who'd raised 5 children during the Depression and worked as a seamstress until her fingers were bent with arthritis, who'd lived her entire life with dignity and grace and an absolute refusal to be anyone's burden. They'd named the baby after her, and I was supposed to fall at their feet in gratitude. "Jamal said Imani asked him to call you," Shanice continued gently. "She wanted you to know that visiting hours are flexible and that she'd very much like to see you at the hospital." I sat quietly, feeling the pull of grandmotherly instinct warring with the hard-won wisdom of the past 6 months. Part of me wanted to rush to the hospital, to hold this new person who shared my DNA, to forgive everything for the chance to be part of her life. It was a physical pull, like gravity, like magnetism, like something coded into my bones. But I'd learned to distrust my immediate emotional responses, to examine them for signs of manipulation, both external and internal. I'd learned that the first impulse wasn't always the right one, that feelings were information, but not instruction. "What do you think she wants?" I asked. Shanice didn't hesitate. "I think she wants to use that baby to reopen negotiations about the trust." It was probably true. In the months since Franco's, Imani had made several indirect approaches. Birthday cards with carefully chosen messages about family and forgiveness. Texts to Jamal about how pregnancy had given her perspective and made her realize what really mattered. Carefully orchestrated encounters at places she knew I frequented. The farmer's market, the library, the coffee shop where I met Brenda once a week. Each contact had carried the subtle suggestion that reconciliation was possible if I was willing to be reasonable about certain financial arrangements, if I was willing to compromise by giving them access to funds from the trust for the baby's immediate needs, if I was willing to admit that maybe I'd overreacted at Franco's. "The baby isn't responsible for her parents' choices," I said, more to myself than to Shanice. "No, she's not," Shanice agreed. "But you're not responsible for protecting yourself from her parents either. Both things can be true, Loretta. You can love that baby and still maintain your boundaries." The next morning I called Brenda. "I've been expecting this call," she said without preamble. "Imani had the baby." "I know. Jamal called me yesterday to give me a heads up. He thought you might need legal advice about how to handle visitation." "What are my options?" "What do you want to happen?" Brenda asked, and I realized it was the question I'd been asking myself since Shanice had delivered the news. Not what Imani wanted, not what Jamal thought was best, not what society expected of grandmothers. What did I actually want? "I want to meet my granddaughter," I said slowly, feeling my way through the words. "But I want to do it on my terms, with clear boundaries, and without opening myself up to manipulation." "That's entirely possible," Brenda said. "We can arrange supervised visits through Jamal. We can establish clear protocols about what topics are off limits, what behaviors will end visits immediately, what consequences will follow if those boundaries are violated. And if Imani refuses those terms, then you'll know exactly where you stand with her," Brenda said gently. "And more importantly, you'll know you protected yourself while leaving the door open for a genuine relationship if she ever chooses to walk through it." That afternoon, I drafted a letter to my daughter. Not the angry tirade I'd written and rewritten in my head over the past months, but a clear, calm statement of boundaries and possibilities. I wrote it longhand on the good stationery Leonard had given me for our 35th anniversary, taking my time with each word, making sure I meant every single one. Imani, I would very much like to meet Eleanor and to have a relationship with her as she grows. However, any contact between us must respect the boundaries I've established for my own well-being. I am willing to visit with Eleanor in Jamal's presence for limited periods, with the understanding that any attempt to discuss the trust, my financial decisions, or past grievances will end the visit immediately. If you can accept these terms, please have Jamal arrange our first meeting. If you cannot, I hope you'll reconsider when you're ready to prioritize Eleanor's relationship with her grandmother over your relationship with my money. I will always love the daughter you were. I am no longer available to be victimized by the person you've chosen to become. With hope for your growth and boundaries for my protection, Mama, I sealed the letter before I could second-guess myself, then walked to the mailbox with the satisfaction of someone who'd learned the difference between giving up and setting terms. The future was still unwritten, but I would write it on my own terms, with my own pen, in my own voice. And if my granddaughter wanted to be part of that story, she would be welcomed with love, wisdom, and the fierce protection of a grandmother who'd learned the greatest gift you can give a child is the example of a woman who cannot be moved. I stood at the mailbox for a long moment after dropping the letter inside, watching the flag go up to signal the postal carrier. Across the street, Mrs. Anderson was tending her garden, the same woman who'd warned me about Devon's inquiries, who'd understood without being told that something wasn't right. She waved, and I waved back. And in that simple gesture was an entire conversation about community and protection and the ways women look out for each other. The sun was warm on my face. 62 years old, and I was still learning who I could become. Leonard would be proud of that, I thought. He'd always said that the day you stopped growing was the day you started dying. I wasn't dying. I was becoming. And whatever came next, whether Imani accepted my terms or rejected them, whether I would rock my granddaughter to sleep or only know her through photographs Jamal shared, whether this family could be rebuilt or only survived, I would face it as myself. Not as someone's victim, not as someone's resource, not as someone who could be moved. Just Loretta, standing in the sunlight, free. This story was written for women over 50 who have faced or fear facing financial exploitation by family members. If this story resonates with you, you are not alone. Elder financial abuse affects 1 in 10 Americans over 60. You are not overreacting. Your boundaries are valid. You deserve protection. Seeking legal help is not betrayal. It's wisdom. Remember, the greatest gift you can give the next generation is the example of someone who cannot be moved.